The laughter hit me first, sharp, glittering, and cruel. The restaurant lights were too bright, reflecting off polished silverware and wine glasses that trembled in my hand. Across the table, my son's smile faltered as the truth spilled out, raw and undeniable, in front of everyone who mattered to him. My heart didn't break with sound. It broke in silence, the kind that swallows you whole. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this happen more often than you think. The wine turned bitter on my tongue, and in that stillness, I finally saw him for who he'd become, or maybe for who I'd made him. That was the night everything began to unravel. I'll never forget that afternoon, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. It was supposed to be a simple celebration, a small dinner where my son introduced his fiancée's family. I wore my best dress, one I had saved for years, pressed it carefully that morning, and told myself to smile no matter what. I wanted to make a good impression, to show them I was proud of my boy, the man I'd raised on my own. But the moment I stepped into that restaurant, something shifted. The room was full of polite laughter, silverware clinking, and the low hum of people who belonged there. People who didn't have to think twice about the cost of a meal. I stood for a second too long at the entrance before my son came over. His smile was tight, his hand barely touching my shoulder. He called me Mom so softly, it was almost like he was embarrassed the word might echo. As dinner went on, I noticed the small things. The way his fiancée's mother looked at my hands, rough from years of cleaning offices. The way my son's voice changed when he spoke to them, smoother, more careful, as if he was trying to erase the parts of himself that came from me. And then came the moment that still stings. Someone asked about his upbringing, where he was from, how he managed to afford college. I waited for him to speak with pride, to tell them the truth, that we'd worked hard, that I'd done everything I could. But instead, he smiled and said something else. Something that made me invisible. Something that made them nod in approval while I sat there, pretending I didn't exist. That night, as laughter filled the room, I realized I was no longer part of his story. I was just the quiet shadow behind the man he wanted the world to see. He left on a rainy Thursday. No warning, no fight, just silence and the sound of the front door closing. I remember standing in the kitchen, my hands still wet from washing dishes, watching the rain trace lines down the window. My son was only 3, sitting on the floor with his toy truck, unaware that his father's footsteps were fading for good. That night, when he asked where Daddy went, I smiled through tears and said he'd be home soon. But deep down, I already knew it would be just the two of us from then on. The years that followed felt like one long, endless shift. I took whatever work I could. Mornings at the diner serving coffee and eggs to people rushing to jobs better than mine. Afternoons cleaning offices that smelled of lemon disinfectant. And nights babysitting other people's children while mine slept alone at home. I'd come back around midnight, my feet burning, my back stiff, but seeing his small face peaceful in sleep always made me forget the pain for a moment. There were nights I counted coins just to make sure there was enough for milk and rent. Some days I skipped lunch so he could have an extra snack at school. But I never wanted him to see the cracks. I wanted him to believe we were okay. Every birthday, no matter how tight the budget, there was always a cake, even if it was just from a box mix. Every morning, I woke before dawn, whispering promises to myself that someday he'd understand what it took to keep him safe and fed. I remember the first time he brought home a drawing of the two of us. He had drawn me with a big smile and a crown on my head. I laughed through my tears that day. In his eyes, I wasn't poor. I was powerful. That memory kept me going more than any paycheck ever could. For years, I believed love and sacrifice were enough to build a better future, that hard work could protect us from disappointment. I thought I was shaping a son who'd be proud of where he came from. I didn't realize I was also teaching him how to leave me behind. Time has a quiet way of stealing things. Laughter, warmth, the little moments that used to fill the house. One day, I was packing lunches and tying shoelaces, and the next, I was standing at the doorway watching my son drive away to college. I remember how proud I felt, how my chest swelled as I waved goodbye. I thought the distance would be physical, something miles could not erase. I didn't realize that sometimes distance begins in the heart long before the body moves away. At first, he called often. He'd tell me about his classes, his new friends, the city lights he could see from his dorm. But slowly, those calls came less. Texts replaced his voice. Then even those became short replies, polite, efficient, as if love had learned to use fewer words. When he did come home, it wasn't home anymore. He'd sit at the table, scrolling on his phone, distracted, impatient. I'd cook his favorite meals, hoping for conversation. But he'd just nod and say he was tired. The small changes hurt the most. When he introduced me to friends, it was always just, "This is my mom," said quickly, like a name he didn't want to linger on. When they asked about my work, he'd change the subject, talk about his internship, his plans, anything but me. I told myself it was just youth, that he was busy building a future. But deep down, I felt it, the quiet shame that settled in the pauses between us. There were moments I wanted to remind him who I was, the woman who carried him, who worked double shifts so he could have more. But love, real love, sometimes keeps quiet. I smiled instead, pretended not to notice how far away his eyes seemed when he looked at me. I thought he was becoming his own man. I didn't realize he was growing away from me. He called one afternoon, his voice polite but distant, asking if I could join him and his fiancée's family for lunch. For a moment, I felt something warm stir in my chest. Maybe this was his way of reaching back, of letting me in again. I spent the morning ironing my blouse and packing the small gift I'd bought for her, a simple scented candle wrapped with care. I told myself it didn't matter where they lived or how wealthy they were. I just wanted to see my son happy. The restaurant was elegant, all glass walls and soft piano music. I felt out of place the moment I walked in, my shoes too plain, my voice too unsure. But I smiled, trying to blend in. His fiancée's parents were kind in that practiced way rich people often are, warm but distant, curious but careful. Then, as the conversation flowed, I began to hear it, the small revisions, the polished story. He said he grew up in a quiet suburb, that his father was a business consultant, that his mother had once run a small design firm. Each word chipped at the truth like a knife, cutting away the years of late nights, the second-hand clothes, the tired smile I wore through every shift. I sat there, nodding, my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling my heart shrink smaller with each lie. There was a moment when his eyes met mine, a silent plea, or maybe a warning, and I understood. He didn't want my truth. He wanted distance dressed as dignity. I didn't correct him. I smiled when they laughed, even as my throat burned with quiet shame. That day, I realized his new life didn't have room for the truth, or for me. It was past midnight when the phone rang. I remember the sound, sharp, urgent, slicing through the quiet like an alarm I'd been waiting for all my life. His voice trembled on the other end, trying to sound calm, but cracking between words. He was in trouble. He didn't say how much, only that he needed help fast. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. When your child says they've made a mistake, a mother's instinct isn't to judge, it's to save. That night, I couldn't sleep. The clock kept whispering the hours. 1, 2, 3, while I stared at the ceiling, doing the math in my head. I knew what I had and what I could lose. By morning, I was already at the bank, the smell of old paper and ink heavy in the air. My hands shook as I signed the forms, the pen slipping once. I told the loan officer it was for home repairs. In truth, it was for my son, my boy who once promised he'd take care of me someday. I sold what little jewelry I had left, a bracelet my mother gave me, a watch from years of service at the diner. I emptied the small savings I'd built for my old age. Each withdrawal felt like cutting off a piece of my future. But I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this was love, that mothers don't measure their worth in dollars, but in sacrifice. When I handed him the money, he hugged me tightly, and for a brief second, I felt the boy I used to know. I thought maybe this was our turning point, that this time he'd learn, rebuild, come back stronger. But months passed, and the calls grew fewer again. The promises faded, the debt was paid, but something inside me stayed broken. I stopped checking the mailbox for repayment. I stopped expecting change. One night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I whispered to myself. I told myself I was buying him time to change, but all I bought was silence. The invitation arrived on thick ivory paper, embossed with gold letters that shimmered under the light. My son's name beside hers, elegant, perfect. I ran my fingers over the words, trying to imagine what kind of world they belonged to. A world where tablecloths were silk and smiles never cracked. I told myself I was proud, that this was what I'd worked for, that everything I'd given up had led him here. The night of the engagement, I took extra care getting ready. I pressed my dress 3 times, pinned my hair just right, and dabbed on a bit of perfume I'd saved for special occasions. On the bus ride over, I practiced smiling, hoping it would come naturally when I saw him. The venue was breathtaking, chandeliers spilling light like liquid gold, laughter floating through the air like a melody I couldn't quite join. My son stood at the center, handsome, confident, every inch the man he wanted the world to see. When he introduced me, his hand lingered on my shoulder, gentle but firm, as if reminding me of something. He said I was his mother, simple, kind, retired. He didn't mention the diner, or the cleaning jobs, or the years of exhaustion written into my hands. And I didn't correct him. I smiled when they complimented me, laughed softly when they spoke of travel and wine I couldn't pronounce. But somewhere between the speeches and the music, I caught a whisper, someone wondering aloud where my refinement came from. The words slid under my skin like glass. I looked at my son then, and he was laughing, free, unbothered, wearing a mask I had helped him build. I stayed until the end, my cheeks aching from the effort of pride. As I left, the night air felt cold against my skin, stripping away the polish and leaving only truth behind. That night, I realized masks can suffocate even the ones who wear them out of love. The night began like every other performance. Soft lights spilling across a long dining table, crystal glasses catching the glow, and laughter that sounded rehearsed. I had learned to play my part by then. Quiet, composed, proud in silence. My son sat across from me, his fiancée beside him, her hand resting gently on his. I remember thinking, for a moment, that maybe this was peace. Maybe all the lies had finally settled into something stable, something that looked like happiness. The food was rich, the kind that leaves a taste of guilt more than flavor. The conversations floated around the table, stories about vacations, investments, careers. I smiled when eyes turned to me, nodded when they asked polite questions, and kept my hands neatly folded in my lap. For a while, it almost felt normal. Then someone asked a question, simple, innocent, something about where my son had grown up. The room went still for just a breath too long. He hesitated, and I saw it, the flicker of panic behind his eyes. He tried to speak, but his words tangled. His fiancée looked at him, confused. One of the guests, a business acquaintance, maybe, mentioned passing by our old diner years ago. Said he remembered a woman there who looked just like me. Time stopped. The silverware clinked, faint but sharp. I felt every heartbeat echo through the room. My son's face drained of color. He tried to laugh it off, to patch the hole, but it was too late. The truth had slipped into the air, heavy and undeniable. I sat perfectly still. The humiliation came in waves, not because they knew I'd been a waitress, but because I saw the terror in my son's eyes. He wasn't ashamed of me. He was ashamed for himself. That was the moment I understood how deep his fear ran, that the lie had become who he was. When the dinner ended, I didn't speak. I gathered my purse, smiled one last time, and walked into the cold night. The streetlights blurred through my tears, but I didn't wipe them away. That night, I didn't lose my pride. I lost my child. The drive home that night felt endless. The city lights blurred past the window like ghosts of a life I didn't recognize anymore. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady but numb. I could still hear the clinking of glasses, the fading laughter, the silence that swallowed the room when the truth slipped free. Every sound echoed in me, a loop that wouldn't stop replaying. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark for a long time, shoes still on, purse still in my lap. The house felt smaller somehow, heavier. The next morning came, but he didn't call. Days passed, then weeks. The phone stayed silent. I checked it anyway, out of habit, out of hope. Each missed day felt like a new kind of goodbye. I thought about his face at that table, how pale he'd gone, how he looked at me like I'd betrayed him simply by existing. But the longer I sat with it, the more I began to understand. He wasn't cruel. He was scared. Scared of being small. Scared of being seen for what he believed he wasn't enough to be. I raised him to dream big, but I never realized how heavy that dream might feel in his hands. I looked around the house, the framed photos, his old baseball glove on the shelf, the mark on the wall where we used to measure his height. The memories didn't hurt anymore. They just whispered. I found myself speaking softly to the air, saying I forgave him, though he wasn't there to hear it. Forgiveness wasn't a grand act. It was a quiet surrender, a choice to keep loving even when love no longer has a place to go. One morning, A small envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside, a short note. No apology. No explanation. Just a few words about moving forward, about hoping I was well. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I placed the letter on the kitchen table, beside the old cup he used to drink from, and smiled through tears that finally felt clean. Pain changes shape over time. It doesn't disappear, but it softens. It teaches you that love isn't about being seen. It's about still caring, even when no one's looking. Morning came softly that spring, the kind of light that doesn't demand attention. It just arrives. The air felt different, gentler somehow. I opened the window and let the breeze in. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of waiting for something or someone. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun spill across the kitchen table. The same table where I'd once cried, where I'd read his letter over and over until the words faded in my mind. Now it was just a table again, not a reminder, but a witness. Life had kept moving, even when I couldn't. I think healing isn't something that happens all at once. It comes in small moments, watering the plants, hearing laughter from the neighbors, realizing you've gone a whole day without replaying the past. It's not forgetting. It's learning to live beside the memory without letting it swallow you whole. I started walking in the mornings again. I planted flowers in the front yard, lilacs, because he used to love their scent when he was little. I joined a community group at the library, started sharing stories, even laughed with strangers who felt a lot like old friends. Bit by bit, I began to belong to myself again. There are still quiet nights when I think of him, of who he was, of who I was. But the ache has softened into something almost beautiful. I'm grateful now, not for the pain, but for the love that made it worth enduring. Every sacrifice, every tear, every silence taught me something about who I am when everything else falls away. If you've ever lost someone you love, not to death, but to distance, I hope you know that peace still finds you. Maybe not today, but someday. And when it does, it will feel like sunlight after a long winter. Sometimes, losing what we love is how we find who we are. The mornings feel quieter now, not because the world has changed, but because I finally have. I sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the first light touch the trees. There's no rush, no ache, just stillness. The kind that comes after a storm has passed and left everything washed clean. Sometimes I think back to the woman I used to be, the one who believed love meant giving everything, even the parts of herself she couldn't replace. I don't blame her. She did what mothers do. She loved in the only way she knew how. But now, I understand something she didn't love doesn't mean saving someone at the cost of losing yourself. It means seeing clearly, forgiving gently, and still choosing peace. Pain has a way of teaching what comfort never could. It strips away the illusions, the pride, the fear, the need to be needed, until all that's left is truth. And the truth is simple. We can't rewrite the choices of others, only how we carry them. My son's story became a mirror for my own, a reflection of how deeply we all crave to be seen, to be accepted, to be enough. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing the hurt. It's about freeing yourself from it. I can look back now without bitterness, without shame. The love I gave wasn't wasted. It built the strength I live with now, the quiet kind that doesn't need applause or proof. We all have someone or something we've had to let go of. A person, a dream, a version of ourselves. And maybe that's the point of life, to lose and love, to break and rebuild, and to find meaning in the space that remains. So if you're listening to this and carrying your own story of heartbreak, I hope you know this. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering with grace. It means learning to breathe again, even when the air feels different. Have you ever had to let go of someone you love to find yourself again? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.